for jumping to lunch first, but I hope you all had a bit of a break and didn't continue to work through. So Paul has told me that Ross and Tracy will be leading off on this, but please introduce yourselves and each other if that's not the case. We have a presentation. If we could wait till after the presentation for questions, but please write them in the chat. Awesome. Kia ora, everyone.
Kia ora, thank you very much. I'm Ross Roberts, Head of Engineering Resilience in the Resilient Land and Coast Department. And on the call today, we have Paul Kleiner, General Manager of Resilient Land and Coasts. And giving the presentation today will be Natasha Carpenter and Tracy Howe. Natasha is the Coastal Practice Lead and is the project sponsor for the Shoreline Adaptation Plans. And Tracy is our Principal Natural Hazards Specialist and has taken a lead role in developing the Whangaparo Shoreline Adaptation Plan. Today they'll be representing a large team from across the council family and beyond that's worked collaboratively to develop this plan. And that includes representatives from community facilities, parks, sports and recreation, healthy waters, Auckland Transport and Watercare. Before we start, I'd like to extend my thanks to Councillors Watson and Walker and the members of the Whiskers and Bays Local Board, and in particular the Chair Gary Brown and Member Janet Fitzgerald for their engagement throughout this process. I'd also like to thank the Mana Whenua groups and members of the local community who were involved throughout to guide this project. It's been vastly improved by all the help that they've given us. And with that, I will pass over to Tracy, who will take you through the presentation, and then the four of us will be available for questions at the end.
Thanks, Ross. Hi, everyone. So I'll be taking you through the kind of regional context first for shoreline adaptation plans and why we require them. And then I'll be taking you through the Whangaparo pilot, which is the first shoreline adaptation plan to be completed for the Auckland region. The shoreline adaptation plans work program will be covering the entire coastline of Auckland, which is about 3,200 kilometers over the next 3 to 5 years. But we're looking forward to getting completion of the pilot. So shoreline adaptation plans, what they are basically adaptive plans that help us as council understand what we need to be doing for the public land and assets in coastal areas to adapt to the impacts of coastal hazards and climate change. So these plans really focus on 3 major hazards. Those are coastal erosion, coastal inundation, which is the flooding of low-lying coastal land, usually during storm events, and also rainfall flooding, which is obviously the flooding from big rainfall events. All of these hazards are going to be increasing because of climate change. Now, as you'll see from the plot on the left-hand side, climate change is an evolving space that depends on what we do and manage to do in the mitigation aspects. But even if we do manage to get down to 0, say tomorrow, we will still have to adapt to the impacts are coming. So what we are doing is planning for the worst case scenario. That is currently the RCP 8.5 scenario, but that is quite a good thing to plan to because it allows us basically flexibility. If there's less impacts, we'll be able to dial down our response, and we're essentially going to be prepared for what can be coming in the future. These plans are developed in the spirit of partnership with Mana Whenua. They are also one of the climate adaptation work streams under Te Tarukia Tawhiri, Auckland's climate plan. As part of the climate plan, we give effect to Te Ora, which is the Maori wellbeing framework put together under the climate plan. And they involve a whole series of Mana Whenua engagement at different levels. So we've been working at the regional level with the Infrastructure and Environmental Services Mana Whenua Forum. We've also then been dealing with local iwi on the pilot plan itself. So the iwi who indicated they would like to be involved on Whangaparoa. And then one of the things that came out of the development of the pilot is the need to also have governance discussions at the Mana Whenua Governance Forum, and we just recently went to Te Potaio to have those discussions. Out of our regional engagement, we have received some guiding principles from Mana Whenua, and they really focus on the need to understand that we are part of the natural environment and that actually naturalizing the coastline and supporting that is going to be one of the big ways in which we can adapt to climate change and mitigate our risk. As I mentioned, these plans focus on the public land and assets. There's reasons for that are related mostly to the ongoing RMA reform, the National Climate Change Act, and all the other bits and pieces that are going to be coming out in the future. But we are working with plans and places on plan change that we can do related to hazards at the moment. But in terms of what public land and asset means, that's all of our reserve areas, our public beaches, our local and regional parks, and all of the assets that support them. Now, as I mentioned, these plans focus very much on these 3 hazards listed here. But the way that we look at that is we do an exposure assessment. So we essentially take the mapping of these hazards, including how they're expected to increase because of climate change, and look at what is going to be impacted by those hazards. And that tells us very much the areas that are at risk now and the areas that will be at risk in the future. And that is how we determine where we need to be adapting and what we need to be adapting to. In terms of adapting, we really work to 4 key strategies. So these are the adaptation strategies that we choose between. And no active intervention is our first one. That essentially means that we don't have to do anything in this area because we can allow the natural environment to take its course. That strategy makes sense in an area where we don't have a lot of things of value, or in a place like a regional park where it is a natural environment and therefore there is space to do that. Limited intervention is where we need to take some steps to support the natural environment or to maintain what's there. And hold the line is, of course, where we decide we need to fix the coastal edge. This can be done through nature-based options or through hard structures. And the last and final one is called managed realignment, where this is really an indication that the risk is much too high and we need to start moving things back out of the hazard zones. So that's the regional context. For Whangaparoa, what's involved in these plans, we obviously have our mana whenua engagement, which is a key component. We also have engagement with the local community because they are the ones who really use and access these spaces that we're planning for. And of course, our technical work stream, which is where we talk to all the asset owners who own things within these areas. And the way that this works is we take the area of coastline that we're looking at, in this case, the Whangaparoa Peninsula, and we break it down into coastal stretches. Now, these are areas of the coast that are changing because of different coastal processes or because of what's there. And we then go through bringing all of the values that we've learned through the engagement work streams and all of the risk impacts that we have from our assessments and our technical work stream together to make some decisions about what we propose to be the strategy over the short, medium, and long term for each one of these stretches. And the bottom plot really shows a graph of, that's the Red Beach area, of what that looks like. So in that area, we're proposing those strategies over the short, medium, and long term. And you can see that that means they change for different areas over time. Now, if you look at Whangaparoa for a whole, what was quite interesting is most of Whangaparoa can be managed with very little intervention. However, there are areas where the risk is going to be increasing and we need to realign out of those hazard zones. There are also areas due to critical infrastructure, we need to hold the line. And in the case of Whangaparoa, that one area was to support a road, another is to support the marina that services the ferry, those kind of decision-making processes. The big outcome of the Shoreline Plan for Whangaparoa is really getting an understanding that some of our best defenses to climate change, particularly in coastal areas, are actually the natural environments that are there. And so looking at the ways that we can support and continue to develop those areas and allow them space is a big priority for actually adapting to some of these future impacts. Also, a recognition that there are some areas in the future where the risk will be escalating and it will be much too high to consider being sustainable, and we need to start thinking about moving things back out of those areas. The erosion zone is kind of a prime candidate for that kind of response. In some cases, flooding is another risk where we will be actually actively managing to realign. Cultural heritage is obviously a big issue on the coast. There are many sites that are coastal, and understanding how we can get a better understanding of where those sites are at and what we can do is some ongoing work with the heritage team. Of course, mana whenua are partners on this project, but we'll continue to be partner on all the implementation aspects of this plan. And talk a little bit about the implementation aspects, I'm going to hand you over to Natasha.
Thank you, Tracy. Yeah, so thanks for your time. We just wanted to finish off with a bit about how we'll be implementing the plans going forward if the Whangaparoa pilot is adopted today. So as we've said, these plans have been developed collaboratively across the council family and more broadly with our CCOs. And this has really set the tone for how we'll continue with that implementation. So taking this forward into, Tracy, if you could just flick the slide slightly. Thank you. So incorporating those high-level strategies across all of our other key documents and plans across Council, including our reserve management plans, our open space management plans, our regional parks management plans and the like. So we'll essentially be working through this implementation alongside the wider rollout of the shoreline adaptation plans across the whole region. Okay, next slide, please. So at a local scale as to what this means for Whangaparoa, it's really around implementation through business as usual at 3 different levels. So at the highest level, it's really looking at how we can develop our implementation and monitoring framework and building on the current information that my team already collects around our beach monitoring and what the current state of our beaches and where operational management is needed will continue. And some of our coastal asset condition assessments to understand what condition our coastal structures, coastal defences are in. This information will feed through into Tier 2, which is really our asset management piece. So taking that information and developing that into our asset management plans, particularly for our coastal structures. So understanding the levels of service and design life of those and how we can use that in conjunction with the high-level strategies of the SAPs to develop those signals and triggers and the dynamic adaptive pathways policy approach into our future asset management. And then finally at the 3rd tier, that's where that feeds down into our work programs, so particularly our operational maintenance for our coastal structures and our more significant maintenance and new structures that may be required through the CapEx renewal. And that's where a lot of the detail of the high-level adaptation strategies will feed through into what some of those options actually look like, particularly around the hold the line approaches. So you'll do the site-specific assessments, understand the option feasibility and the costings before you move towards a preferred solution for any of those. And as this process is going through, obviously we'll be reflecting on this in our future LTP budget allocations to make sure that we can provide for this. And final slide. At a regional level, the SAPs sit as quite an umbrella document, providing that high-level strategy across Auckland and are really heavily guided by what we have at the current RMA, the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement and the Auckland Unitary Plan, and are also really quite pivotal in our sort of application of the Ministry for the Environment, Coastal Hazards and Climate Change guidance document for local government. So as we take these forward, once we've completed all 16 of those shoreline adaptation plans across all 3,200 kilometres of our coast, we'll be combining this with our regional coastal hazard risk assessment, which is currently underway, to really understand where our high priority areas are and develop that with yourselves into a regional prioritisation and funding schema so that we can start to understand what funding is required in the future and how we best align that to those high level strategies that have been identified for each respective area. And that will feed through into our local board plans and our local board decision making. So that was really everything that we had to cover off today. And I would just like to thank you all for your time and acknowledge that this has been quite a lengthy process since the Coastal Management Framework was originally published. So we're very excited to be here today with our first climate change adaptation strategy for the Auckland region. And thank the wider project team once again for their work and happy to take any questions.
Kia ora, thanks Natasha and Tracy and Ross and Paul and team, and yeah, I think this is fairly momentous, and this budgets to do the whole coast, starting with Whangaparoa because of its I guess diversity of types of coast made a lot of sense to start here, and the work and the detail is pretty phenomenal. So thank you all. I'll go to Pārtai. First of all, before I go to Member Wilson, I did ask Councillor Walker and Watson yesterday, although I've only had a chance to speak to Councillor Walker if they would move and second this. They do not have to feel obliged, but just checking if you still want to do that. Councillor Walker and Watson? Otherwise, I'm happy to move.
Yes, happy to do that. I did indicate some reservations, but yes.
Okay, cool. Councillor Walker will move, and Councillor Watson, are you happy to second?
Yes, but I have one matter to bring up, Mr. Chair, but happy to second as it stands.
Thank you both, and I'll put you, I assume, on the questions or comment side. Pārtai from Member Karen Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'd have to say my ICT yet again is letting me down, unless it's my brain that's gone blank. So you'll have to excuse me for just taking a little bit longer to recall the points that I'd noted down there. So being a significant piece of work, and we've spent some time on other items that relate to the water strategy, I guess my questions are around the consultation with mana whenua. I did hear you say partners. So in terms of the consultation, can you indicate on Mr. Chair, I have three partai. Can you indicate on your slide how that encompassed the collective view and the individual view and those that would consider themselves to have significant interests? Can you explain to me how that occurred, please?
Through the chair. So as I mentioned, there were multiple levels of mana whenua engagement on the plan. The first kind of tranche of engagement started with the INES Regional Forum. And we very much went to the regional forum with kind of an open-ended discussion around the implementation of the coastal management framework and how we could incorporate mana whenua values into understanding what we need to do for the coastline and coastal areas going forward. And that led to the development of the guiding principles, which I showed at the this slide here. And these guiding principles are for all shoreline adaptation plans across the region. Our discussions with Ngāti Manahari governance and then also with Te Pōtaiao indicated that because of their strategic level, these plans also require kind of governance oversight from mana whenua. And they suggested that once all the shoreline adaptation plans are complete from the regional perspective, that perhaps having a Maori outcomes measurement index for the plans and how their implementation is meeting Maori aspirations would be a good thing to have going forward. And so we will continue to have that discussion with Te Pōtaiao as the plans develop. As I mentioned, the program will be taking about 3 to 5 years to go through the process. But once we get to that regional, the full picture of the regional aspects, we can work that through. In terms of the local iwi engagement, we worked with Ngāti Manahari and Ngāi Taiki Tamaki. They were the two iwi who indicated they would like to be involved in the process of this development. And with their representatives wrote the Maori value, mana whenua value section that is in the plan, the Mataranga a Iwi section, and they gifted these particular values for coastal projects, and they also brought forth kind of 3 major themes, which are whakapapa, taiao, and tangata honanga, and these themes were used across the decision making in the plan and were built into the adaptation strategies. Sorry, the other aspect is, of course, we do respect and align to Te Ora, which is the mana whenua value system within the climate plan. And also we have written a section around giving effect to Ki Ora, which is the Maori Performance Measurement Index that is currently in place for Council.
Thank you. I suppose all I'm really indicating that it's quite a complex piece of work, especially when you're talking about a shoreline adaptation in terms of the consultation that needs to be undertaken, and it does require quite a robust, I suppose I would describe it, and they're not reliant on others to tell you who's who, is also probably helpful. I understand it's in a pilot. I would suggest that needs to be looked at. You identified yourself that it should operate at a governance level, and yet you've described the INES as a regional and then have only just gone across to a governance forum. I really believe in the same way the water strategy this morning went through with great celebration and excitement from a mana whenua perspective, that this could also do with some more how would I describe, cursory look at how these processes should be done, undertaken as they go from shoreline to shoreline, which will change. So what is the process that could be undertaken? I offer up absolutely any assistance that can be provided through the Secretariat at IMSB to aid you, or even Toby seems to have got himself in a really good position as to partnership with Māori. Is my first question. The other is, how will your learnings from the iwi engagement across the development of the pilot be implemented across the future shoreline adaptation plans? And can you tell me what these learnings were?
Sure, through the chair. First, I'd like to thank you for your offer. We are in the process of developing the regional plan for these for the program. So very interested to hear how we can streamline some of the Mana Whenua work streams. I'm more than happy to take that advice. In terms of the implementation aspects related to Mana Whenua values, within the plan itself, we did Mana Whenua wrote specific examples of what giving effect to their values actually means, and that is in the section that they wrote. In the adaptation strategy sections, I co-wrote with the iwi representatives for Whangaparoa another section on how these adaptation strategies reflect the Mana Whenua values that were put forward and what it actually means to respect particularly Taiao and Tangata Honunga within these areas. And the way that we've written the implementation section, we do indicate that future coastal projects need to, of course, involve continued Mana Whenua engagement with iwi, but also need to consider and understand not only the values that are written in the plan, but also the frameworks that need to be given effect to.
Thank you. So just to not repeat, in order to be able to do that, you need to identify the groupings, and I'm not sure that there is a system that's been identified, who will be those that you will be consulting with. So I suppose I'm just indicating to the consultation process needs to be very, very robust. And as you move around the motu and the area, you will need to ensure that they continue. It may have seemed very easy in this case, but then again, this pilot hasn't rolled out as such. I'm signalling to you a word of caution as to how, if you're wanting partnership, how you're undertaking the consultation phase, and then more importantly, how you're integrating the component pieces of work that you're taking from other documents, including Te Tauruki a Tāwhiri, is incorporated into what you're doing here. There's a lot of linkages there that haven't obviously been seen. I'm going to leave it there for the time being because I'm assuming you're getting my point around how you're incorporating, how you're consulting, how you're doing things in different areas with different iwi who will have different values and different mātauranga Māori, how you're anticipating, incorporating and integrating that into a pilot and then ultimately a document. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Member Wilson. Very, very good points, because it won't be and I assume with the communities as well, won't be a one-size-fits-all type approach, but very, very good points around how that, whether it's inviting, who you invite, how each part works, and then also the implementation I would manage as partnership approach for every time there's something changing on the coast that comes from this sort of benchmarked plan to begin with. Councillor Watson, questions?
Yes, okay. Yeah, a couple of questions. The first question just goes to a bit of a translation, if you don't mind. In some, and I'm taking a little bit of an interest in some of the specific coastal stretches here that appear in the plan, because I'm like Councillor Walker, familiar with the areas. There's a comment made at one point that with respect to one of the coastal stretches that, quote unquote, the future renewal of coastal stairways and access points in this area should include provision for a full coastal hazard assessment and any required risk mitigation. So I'm particularly interested in what that phrase hazard assessment and required risk mitigation means in terms of renewals.
Through the chair, I'll start part of the answer, and then I think Ross and Natasha can continue and fill in some gaps. One thing that we were aware of as we were developing the pilot is that there is quite a lot of work that is required by other teams in order to understand how we're providing services in these areas and how we can continue to provide services in these areas in a way that is resilient in the face of some of the impacts we are expecting. And one of the things that we were looking to signal in the plan is that there are, of course, particular types of assets where they need to be in hazard zones. Coastal stairways are a good example. And one of the assessments that we were indicating, and we did have discussions with the parks team about this, was around looking at the network of access points and where which are considered critical, and how we can actually understand the ways in which we can build those to be more resilient, so that they're not necessarily being, consistently destroyed and rebuilt. Ross, do you have a comment?
Thank you, Tracy. Yes, through the chair, I think it's fair to say that this is making sure we're embedding good asset management practice. It's easy sometimes to renew an asset when it fails without looking at how the hazards have changed. And in a changing climate, we need to ensure that we've considered the changes in the environment that those assets are experiencing. So this is just making sure that that is flagged, really made very apparent that it needs to be considered. And it ties in really nicely with some work that Natasha and her team have done to provide guidance on how to do those hazard assessments. So we've got a consistent approach to doing the hazard assessments, making sure that we're managing the changing hazards and taking that into account in our decision-making process about renewals. Natasha, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. I think you've covered it off quite well, but I would say really it's about council walking the talk. So making sure that we do the same and that we sort of make sure that we're aware of what the future risks could be, particularly around coastal erosion and coastal inundation, so that we can plan for them and reduce the future costs and maintenance costs that we might get if we continue to place infrastructure into maybe not quite the best location, or ways that we can build the resilience where there's a requirement to be at the coast.
Okay, good. So I was glad I heard that comment and how we can build the resilience better, because along a number of these coastal stretches you've identified is that there has been a lot of renewals over the years, but the renewals have been necessitated by not having the right structure. So essentially just repeating the same form of construction for it to be destroyed by the next storm. In parts of Whangaproa now, we have some excellent structures that have been put in that weather those storm events and have not had to be renewed. In fact, are now community features, if you like, of the area. So I'm glad that's been picked up, and I think conceivably as we go across Auckland, that local voice and pinpointing what has worked, and people are in a position to compare, say, the last couple of decades, that should be valuable information that's captured. My next question, Mr. Chair, this pilot is to be commended for the extent of the consultation and the manner in which the consultation was carried out. It was very well done. However, at this point, as far as the plan goes, what intention, if any, is there to go back to the community in terms of response to the finished product? And I'll explain why I asked that after your answer.
Through the chair, I'm just going to share my screen again. So the community engagement, as you've mentioned, was fairly extensive, but what came out of the community engagement were these targeted objectives of the things that the community most value would like to see going forward. And the idea of these objectives is that all future projects in the coastal area will consider them and start to build those into the planning processes when new assets or other things come in. And so the community will start to see some of the things that they are interested in and that they value coming through as we implement the plan. In terms of going back to community, we certainly plan to do a media push so that people are aware that the plan is finished. We don't intend at this stage to do another open day, but that is always on the cards if it's recommended.
And if I can add to that, please, Tracy, through the chair, can you go to the slide where we discuss the plans that will be implemented in? This by itself is a plan, doesn't immediately change anything. It's only when it gets put into effect into other plans that it has those direct impacts on the decisions that we make. So things like the reserve management plans. And so there will be opportunities to see how this is being implemented through those plans and the consultation that goes along those.
Final question, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, it goes to some of the recommendations in the plan, and for the most part, that recommendation is no active intervention or limited intervention. So it's a largely leave things as they are for the moment approach. In one particular instance, and it's a little unfair for me to pick this out because such a good body of work has been done here and it has been very thorough. But in one particular instance, there's a coastal stretch that's identified, the one in Fisherman's Rock Reserve, and it has a number of observations in it that are incorrect, really, is the best way to describe that, and certainly would not be supported by the community in terms of what is said about this particular facility. What, without me sort of relitigating the specifics of it here, what ability in amongst what you've said there is there for me in the first instance, and I guess the wider community, to now essentially contest, because this is one of the few areas where there is a specific recommendation in the short term that in my view is inappropriate. So notwithstanding everything else that's been done very well, there's this instance, and there might be maybe another one, or who knows, where people disagree, and there would be very strong community response if and when it becomes aware. So what do you recommend that we do in those circumstances?
Ross, do you want to? I have an answer, but I'll.
So there will be multiple opportunities to address this, and we would welcome suggestions for alternatives as well. The first thing to bear in mind is that when we say short term here, we're talking about 20 years. So this is not a document that we are going to lock for 20 years and not review. As things change, as new information becomes available, and as new hazard information becomes available, it will need to be updated. And particularly when the RMA reform comes through, that's going to have quite a significant impact on the scope of SAPs and how we deal with them. So we'll need to look at what that RMA reform says and review it at that point. And so there will be a major opportunity to give significant input at those stages. At the same time, there is the opportunity to give input when asset management plans, parks management plans, reserve management plans, and so on are put forward. And if you think that that is not adequate and that there is an extra round of consultation that is required on this, we'd welcome that suggestion, that feedback, because this is a pilot and we are learning as we go the best way to implement it.
Okay, thanks. That's a good answer, and I will take you up on that offer, because there's been some sterling work done here, but I think there are a couple of other things that can be refined, and particularly in the instance I'm thinking of, that will be useful as we take this across the region as a whole. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Good questions, and thanks to staff for those answers. And now, Councillor Walker, you did indicate you had on the phone to me that you had some questions, or would you prefer to save those for comments?
No, I'm happy to ask them by way of questions. I guess I've got a few fairly simple questions that are just clarifications. They're pretty obvious. The first one is really just to clarify, and I think it is obvious, that the study only applies to council assets around the shoreline. It doesn't cover off any impacts on private property, even when that private property is directly behind the council asset. That's correct, isn't it? Sure. And then in terms of Whangaparoa, even though Whangaparoa Bay actually covers off Orewa, which is part of the overall complex, Arewa is not included in the scope, or the Arewa estuary, which impacts on Red Beach, which is part of the scope. That's correct, isn't it?
Through the chair, yes, that's correct.
Sure. So I've just got a question here, and it goes to the basis of this comment where it says in point 8, most of Whangaparoa's shoreline areas can be managed over the next 100 years. So that's 100 years from now, with little or no active intervention. And my question goes to this. Given the magnitude of storm events globally that are escalating dramatically, the worst case scenario that is applying around that, the ever lower barometric pressure and the impact on storm surges and the like, is that a credible statement to make? And what supports it by way of the latest science? And I'm talking about obviously the IPCC, but ongoing reports, anything up to a week or so ago in terms of the currency of that statement. Thanks.
Through the chair, I'll start the answer for this one and then pass it over to Tracy and Natasha to add some extra details. So I'll start from the perspective of my background, which is as a geologist. Most of Whangaparoa's shoreline area is cliff. And when it comes to management options for cliff, there are very limited options for us. And so there are certain areas where you can reinforce cliffs, you can do some limited replanting, but in most cases there aren't practical, pragmatic options available. And so I do believe it is entirely valid to say that most of Whangaparoa's shoreline can be managed over the next 100 years with little or no active intervention. Things do change a little bit when you get to the areas of beaches, and then you'll see in the maps that those are the areas where it is more likely that there will be comments around some sort of intervention. And I'll pass over to Tracy and Natasha to build on that for them.
Thanks, Ross. Through the chair, I'll take it from here. So Whangaparoa Peninsula, we've used all of our most up-to-date coastal hazards information that we have. So our coastal erosion and our coastal inundation mapping, and we've used that out to 2130, the 100-year plus scenario under the highest climate change projections, and building in for the 1% AEP 100-year coastal storm inundation events. So we've really taken, for now, the sort of most conservative approach that we can with the data that we have that's available. We're obviously building in on the dynamic adaptive pathways approach. So we're looking at providing for that most conservative example for now, and also being able to flex as that might change over time. So if we do experience greater sea level rise, or if sea level rise and extreme events do not eventuate in the patterns that we're currently seeing, then also being able to tone that back down again as well. So I think for now what we have is quite robust, and as Ross had said earlier, that there are opportunities for us to revisit this as the plan continues to be reviewed over time. Tracy, anything to add?
Through the chair, the only other comment to make is that obviously Whangaparoa is just one part of Auckland, and other parts of the coastline will have very different risk levels, very different impacts, and probably very different choices of strategies. So it's unlikely that the rest of Auckland will be in the state of not needing that too much intervention. But certainly for Whangaparoa, the fact that most of it is actually cliff area is one of the big reasons that it has come out that way.
Okay, so if I give you some examples, what happens if the low-lying beach areas with large flat areas like Stanmore Bay, Matagatea, Arkles Bay, Manly, and all of those areas that I'm quoting are actually historic swamps, so they have had significant amounts of water in them. If those areas are inundated, and I'd suggest there's a high likelihood of that within the next 100 years, is there going to be little or no intervention? Is that what you're saying? So
obviously for this plan, when we're talking about the public land and assets, the things that came out of the community values for those areas were that they were beach environments, And in order to maintain space for the beach environments, we do need to start realigning our assets out. Once you get to a certain level of sea level rise, which, to be fair, when you're talking permanent inundation in these areas, that's quite a high level of sea level rise. You will be looking at the property owners in those areas having potential issues. But that discussion of whether or not we would defend Manly Bay, for an example, that has to be part of the larger unitary plan discussions, the RMA reform process. But for the public land and assets, very much it was a decision around looking at the values, looking at what we could do, and the community support was very much to maintain the natural environment, which means that for us, we can make space for that to happen.
Okay, so I guess if I home in on that, if these large flat areas of land that are old swamps, like the flat part of Stanmore Bay, the flat part of Manly and so on, if they contain substantial public assets, which are actually large parks, and the parks are there in part because those areas historically couldn't be developed for residential housing, they were severely flood prone, what intervention will we be doing in terms of providing alternative park space in those areas?
I'll pass you to Russ.
Yeah, probably best place to answer this is by looking at the next stages of this, which is the implementation. So when we look at our parks management plans, for example, that's where we look at the impact of these decisions on service provision for things like playing fields. And in many cases, what we'll find is that there's a limited actual direct impact on things like playing fields, because a flood every few years, or even potentially every few months, doesn't stop it being a playing field. But when it gets to the point where it does, the parks management plans are places where it will say, okay, in future, we need to make sure there's an allowance for new playing fields somewhere else, perhaps by co-locating with local schools, things like that. There are options available where there is existing land that can be used more wisely or differently to make that available for the community. And that's all part of the parks planning process, which is driven from this as the next stage.
Okay.
Wayne, you muted yourself. I don't know if you mentioned.
Sure,
it.
I'll speak later. Thanks.
Cool, thank you very much. And I didn't have any other questions apart from maybe if you just want to briefly just, oh no, that can come at a different time. I was just going to say that you're already working on 2 other plans and it will continue to roll out, but we don't need to go into that detail here. Apologies. We'll go straight to, so Councillor Walker, you've moved to this. Did you want to speak first, or did you want to round up after Councillor Watson and then myself and anyone else speaks?
No, I'm happy just to make some comments now.
Okay,
you know, I'm pleased that we actually have an adaptation plan. I guess my concern is that anybody reading the plan would be quite complacent and think that you know, there's nothing to worry about for the next 100 years. And I would suggest that the insurance community would not agree with that, and that any number of homes that are within the catchment of these areas will become uninsurable, and that process is already underway, and it's happening at other parts of New Zealand that we know about that are subject to inundation. So my particular concern when I read this is that I don't see much in the way of intervention. I do see you mention things about, you know, assets and the like. I don't know what happens to the leisure centre in Stanmore Bay, for example, if that floods on a regular basis because it's in a floodplain and so on. So there are some significant council assets that we will have to intervene on in these areas. And in that respect, I think, and it probably goes to the comment that Councillor Watson made, there's not the granularity here to deal with some of these issues. So I think we've done something because we have to do it, but I don't think it's got anywhere near any detail that provides anybody in the community with much of an idea about what's happening in the future, other than, well, you know, we're not going to be intervening. Doesn't tell anybody much. Okay, so yes, we've done it. That's good. It's a first step. Quite obviously, we're going to have a look at these other plans, but certainly in terms of realism, I don't think it's particularly realistic. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. I saw now this would be out of order, but because you haven't had a chance to speak, Paul, did you want to speak to? I didn't give you a chance if you needed to. So you just put your hand up, or was that a mistake?
Thank you, Councillor Hills. Just briefly, just responding to the good points that Councillor Walker has made there. I think just reinforcing the point that the granularity around these plans is coming, and it'll be integrated in the asset management plans, the reserve management plans, and those discussions. But I think just a word of caution for council that although the plan for Whangaparoa paints a picture where little intervention is required over the next 100 years, just reinforcing that's not our expectation for other areas of Auckland. And the plans we bring back to ECC in time, so we are working in Beachlands and East and Little Shoal Bay at present, you may find that our conversations are a little different to the conversations that we're having here today. So by nature of Whangaparoa, there is a path mapped out by nature of that location, that geography, that topography. But for other parts of Auckland, we will be having slightly different conversations and challenging ourselves with more of the here and now requirements in that sort of less than 20-year time period. So I just wanted to reinforce that, and including just responding to Councillor Walker's comments there that certain people may pick up this plan and it doesn't tell them much, or it might not mean so much. Just reinforcing it is a very tangible start to a conversation around climate change adaptation for the first time for Auckland in this space. We do present some really robust data. Some of that data we have commissioned ourselves as a council. So the most up-to-date erosion susceptibility data, which sort of puts us ahead of most councils in New Zealand. And I think it speaks to, for the first time, helping communities understand some of what these challenges are moving forward, but in a way that it's a stepped approach. It hasn't jumped all the way to step 10, talking about the granularity of certain things and the cost of doing certain things tomorrow. But it really does introduce the discussion, I feel, in a way that we're bringing the community, mana whenua, stakeholders with us on a discussion that's going to be iterative over time. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you, Paul. And sorry, members, that I know that it's not normal practice to have a staff member speak during the debate or reply to a councillor, but I just didn't give Paul the opportunity to speak there. So sorry, Councillor Walker, if you felt that was out of order, but I thought it was important for Paul.
I'm quite happy in this instance. Okay, bye.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Watson.
Yes, I'd just like to start off by commending the team that's been involved in this and the way they conducted the public information sessions. That it was, it was professionally run. It was very welcoming, and people were really encouraged to speak. So I think there's all due recognition to the people involved in that, and the kind of atmosphere that was established, and especially the way people were willing to listen to what people were saying. It is hard getting people out in this day and age, to come along, and they did conduct quite a number of sessions. I would say, though, that in this pilot in Whangaparoa, of course, and it'll be like a number of other areas in Auckland, the coastal environment is part of their life, is part of the people's DNA. So if there is one aspect of their life or the interaction with council that means a lot to them, it's this environment they live in, and the council structures and facilities contribute to that often in a very significant way. So I'm hoping that during the course of this, that some of the lessons of this first pilot program can be used for the benefit of the other parts of Auckland. My interest in particular has been to do with the renewal of coastal assets or coastal infrastructure, and certainly what's become very apparent to me is that firstly this infrastructure is really valued by the community. So a set of stairs is not just a set of stairs, it's actually their access to, in some cases, a couple of kilometres of the coast. If they can't get down there, they can't get to a beach, they can't get to the fishing spot, they can't get there to launch their kayak. And what we've had, and particularly in the coastal stretch I'm familiar with, is yes, over the years, a constant spate of renewals because the infrastructure has been damaged. But what has finally emerged after years and years are structures now that do stand up. Yes, they are more expensive, I assume, than the repairs that were done previously. But the structures there now, by trial and error, are robust, are standing up to these big storm surges. And if the option had been, as it might be going forward, that, sorry, they're too expensive, that access, that quality of life will have been lost. Whereas the iterative process is actually, I'm hoping, now more aware of what has to be done at specific locations to do the job once and to do it right. And that essentially solves the problem of ongoing maintenance for quite some time. My final point goes to really the necessity or the desirability, I should say, of both the local community, but also elected members getting involved in terms of the information that's relayed. So in this instance, the lion's share of the information has been very helpful. The recommendations are entirely appropriate, and it kind of captures the way going forward. In a couple of instances, and at least one instance, it's hard for the people doing this review to understand fully what may happen in any given location. They might go through in the middle of the day and that's not the height of the summer or whatever. But there is instances where that sort of local knowledge, which really establishes the fundamental value of a particular asset, for instance, it really needs to be captured, or else it will be lost. It's impossible to capture each coastal stretch in detail in that nuanced form. So I'll certainly be putting in some feedback to you in terms of one location. But overall, I thank you for your work, and I'm sure the rest of Auckland will be the beneficiaries of this pilot as it been conducted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Watson, and thank you both, yourself and Councillor Walker, for the constructive, proactive approach you've played throughout this process, and same with the local board members. And I thank you both for moving and seconding this item, because it's not always easy to support something that in general you support, but there's lots of details that you may not necessarily agree with or want to support when it's in a written form without all the context there. So thank you both for supporting the staff and supporting this plan direction. And as has been said, that this is quite a big deal to have this shoreline adaptation plan done, a pilot through the 10-year budget last year. We've now funded the whole coast to be done this way, and I think this plan going forward will stop the ad hoc kind of nature we have done replacing and dealing with slips and assets and flooding and coastal damage that we have done in the past. I think the Tasman Tempest, the 2017-18 time, I think there was about 150, I think I remember talking to Ross, 150 slips just on public land that time, and we had a number of community facilities assets and coastal assets and wharves and things that were broken and damaged, and we're talking in the millions of millions that just in 1 or 2 years from significant storms. So as Councillor Watson says, it's important that we're getting the right assets in the right places, but maybe going into the future, even the right assets are not going to be fit for purpose at all in some of these areas, with the storm surges, with the coastal erosion, with other issues. So what this does do is set a benchmark, send a clear message to other plans for local boards, for different departments of the organisation, to make sure that they're looking at this every time they plan ahead or prioritise assets. So we are going to get into a continual debate or argument operationally of where the budget goes. There will never be an endless amount of money, but it will be protecting that leisure centre because it's better to have a leisure centre for the next 20 years, or be important to support that beach because it has a large number of people accessing it. But in some other cases, it might mean that we move to a different space or look to buy land or open up land in other spaces which are safer and are not going to cost us millions of dollars every year to address. So I think what the team have shown is that extremely smart people are doing a lot of work in this space and have really tried to bring the community along with them. And the evidence base shows that what you've brought to us, but the proof will be in the pudding going forward when we start to have to make those individual decisions for individual assets or individual beaches or cliffs and stuff. And this also builds backwards into the water strategy and Te Tarakia Tawhiri, but also in that too much water discussion, because it will show where we are responsible, where we need to be responsible, where we can't be, in the private space, and where it's an insurer policy or where it actually comes back on us because we're consenting things in the wrong place. So I think this is all tying up, and I really, really, really do appreciate all the work that the staff and those you've contracted in and others to do this as well. So as far as I can see, there is no more speakers or anything, so we will just all those in favour?
Aye.
Thank you. Anyone opposed?
Mr. Chair, I'll just email through to Suad the one section 6.3.42 that I'm opposed to, but that I think that covers off then my concerns.
Yeah, please do that. And if Councillor Walker, if you have a similar specific, you can note send that through to Suad, and she'll note that underneath. Thank you both for that. Cool. Thank you very much, and thanks to the staff. You can go go back to what you were doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, we now go on to something completely different.